As you may have read on Facebook, I opted to bring in a co-conspirator for this one. So unfortunately, you guys are going to have to sit through a second night of Jason in a week. I apologize for that. It's the best we could do. We're going to start tonight. You know the content, or you know the topic at least. We're going to start tonight in and maybe a surprising place. I want to talk tonight for just a second, about measurable happiness in marriages in terms of the secular marriage and family research world. Okay? Now, the reason I say that is because a lot of what we've done over the course of the last 7 or 8 weeks has been for the purpose of trying to increase those measurable areas of connectedness and to try to make your marriage look more like those healthy marriages that we observe out in the wild, right? So in those places, the secular world has put together their opinion and their belief of what creates a happy marriage. And what you see in front of you is a visual representation of what all that data and all that research put together says. Now you may notice there's a bunch of stuff in this sound relationship house that we've done over the course of the last couple of weeks. We built love maps, we talked about fondness and admiration. There's a bunch of this stuff that we've done. I want you to look at the very top. At the very top of this is based on research and data, and again, the secular world looking to explain what makes marriages happy, the highest, the pinnacle of marital happiness, those marriages that are working better and moving faster and moving farther than any other marriage out in the wild, are those that create a shared meaning. They have a meaning for their life. The meaning is a shared meaning, and it's a meaning that's explored on a regular basis. Viktor Frankl is if you haven't heard Viktor Frankl's or haven't read Viktor Frankl's stuff, he is the guy who wrote Man's Search for Meaning. He wrote his book From a Concentration Camp, and it's one of the most powerful books you're going to read about life perspective. He was the father of existential theory in the counseling world, but I know you don't care about that for the purposes of tonight. He has a quote: "The pursuit of meaning in life is more important than the pursuit of happiness because it's more enduring, connects us to the present and the future." So creating a shared meaning in our marriage is what happiness is truly all about. So the question is, when you look at the research, how do you do that? How do you actually create a shared meaning? I'm giving you these 4 points. We're not really going to delve into these 4 specifically. We're going to do something slightly different. But I want you to see, if you were to walk into a marriage and family therapist's office in a private practice somewhere where there was going to be no faith platform for your marital exploration, this is probably the kind of stuff you would do. You would share a common dream or vision. You talk about it. You create daily rituals, weekly rituals. The research says something about magic 5 hours, and what that essentially means, that's something John Gottman came up with. It basically means that 5 hours a week, you're connecting with your spouse about this shared dream and about this shared vision, and you implement your shared goals through those conversations. Now, here's why I'm talking about all that research. You notice how when the secular world attempts to define what makes marriage truly happy, when they attempt to define what makes marriages really work, do you notice how they seem to just kind of describe Christianity? They seem to describe a faithful marriage and a faith-based marriage without using those words. This is what we are going to explore tonight. We are going to explore the cheat sheet that we all have to happy and successful marriages. See, we don't have to dig for shared meaning. I've worked with couples who really have to dig to find something that they can wrap themselves around as a couple. We don't really have that obstacle. We can create a shared meaning based on our shared faith and based on our belief in our very loving and gracious Father. I want you to do something for me before we get into this. And I'm going to hand this over to Jason in just a second. But before I do, I want to ask how you're doing. And I want you to take a second to figure it out. So flip over to page 2. You know I love my Cosmo quizzes. And I'm going to give you one today, and this one's going to be a little more personal than the ones we've done in the past. I'm only going to give you 60 seconds because the questions are straightforward and the scoring is simple. You get 1 point for every yes. You get no points for every no. I will give you 60 seconds. You may begin. Don't forget to put your total down at the bottom. All right, I'm seeing some eyes. You ready for your score? Ready to find out if you passed? All right. You'll know, or you'll remember for the last 8 weeks now, every time we've done one of these, I've given you a number that indicates whether this is a strength or a struggle. There is no number tonight. Because your number is not an appropriate thing for me to evaluate as to whether you have a healthy Christ-centered marriage. So here's what you think about. Instead of putting yourself on some arbitrary number that I decide that, yeah, if you get 6 of them, you're healthy. If you get 5, you're not. Instead of that, here's what you think about. Wherever you are, the goal tonight is to go a little higher. There are 11 questions for you on that piece of paper. If you scored an 8, God, that's a good thing. We want to get you to a 10. If you scored a 2, God bless you. We want to get you to a 4. And which of you are not, is to take the things that you see on this paper and to project you into a spiritual life with your spouse. And to begin that process, I'm going to hand this over to Jason.
You know, for me, when I first read the question, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? When I first read the question about, like, who's more spiritual, you or your wife, I'm like, that's an easy response. I mean, Tirsa. I really appreciate Ryan asking for me to come and to share and to be a part. And I greatly appreciate the things that he's done over the last 7-8 weeks in here. It's been a beneficial thing for, it's been pretty cool for Tirsa and I to be able to come and to be a part of a class, because normally as a couple, you know, and you know, we're not normally a part of a class together. And so that's been really neat, just to be able to be a couple and to sit here and to listen, to learn, and to gain some insight. And so I'm grateful for Ryan for what he's done over the last number of weeks. And the thing is, too, I normally teach this class on Wednesday nights, and so I've gotten off the hook for that over the last couple of weeks. And the thing is, too, I normally teach this class, and I mean, max, we have what? For those of you who are in here, maybe 50 on a Wednesday night. And so the potential is for us to have 150 in here every Wednesday night. And so here in a couple of weeks, whenever he's through, make sure that you come back. We're going to talk tonight about this idea of shared vision, and especially how it relates to Christ and having a Christ-centered marriage. And then also, I really appreciate the way that Ryan has built into this over the last couple of weeks in talking about our families of origin. Everybody thinks that their normal is normal until they realize that it's not normal. You ever notice that? And just to think about the things that we experience as people, as children, the things that we experience in life, and how those events, how they mold us and shape us in ways that are good, in ways that are healthy, but how they also mold us and shape us in ways that are not healthy. Tirsa's dad grew up in a super unhealthy home. Tirsa's dad's name is Jim. And Jim grew up in just a very dysfunctional home, and he was an adult before he realized it. Because everybody thinks their normal is normal until they realize that, no, this is not normal. He graduates high school at 18 years of age. He goes to A&M. He has his Thanksgiving break, and he's got his roommate who's from out of state, and his roommate is not going to go home for the Thanksgiving holidays, and so the roommate is going to come and spend Thanksgiving with him here in the Metroplex. He goes to his house. They have a Thanksgiving meal. Tirsa's dad, Jim, he grew up in a home to where mom did not eat at the table with the family. Mom was not allowed to sit at the table with the family. She stood behind Jim's dad, and if he needed something, then she would get something. If the kids needed something, then she would get something. And Jim's dad, whenever he needed something, he would go and just snap his fingers. So he would say, corn, or tea. Now for Tirsa, it would take me snapping about twice before there was another snap, and it would be my finger snapping in half, right? But Jim's dad, he would be sitting at the head of the table, and he would say, corn, or tea. And so he invites this friend home, his Thanksgiving break, his freshman year away from home. And after their Thanksgiving meal, this friend says, what's going on with your mom and your dad? Your dad sat there at the table, and he just snapped and barked orders, and your mom stood behind him and just did whatever he asked. Jim, 18 years old, had no clue. He had no clue that wasn't the way that things were supposed to be. Because everybody's normal is normal until we realize that it's not normal. And so I really appreciate Ryan's approach in looking at our families of origin and how they impact how we view things, how we see things. And for us to recognize, okay, maybe some of these things that I experienced earlier in life, maybe they were okay, maybe they were good, maybe these are the things that I want to emulate. But there also might be some things that I don't want to emulate, that I don't want to integrate into who I am as a husband, or who I am as a father, or who we are as couples. And I think just the beginning of that process of recognizing that puts us way ahead of the game. And so to move tonight toward this idea of shared meaning and shared purpose. You're looking hopefully on the screen is Proverbs 29:18 up there. So this is in the King James Version because it kind of fits my purposes here, the way that it couches this statement. Where there is no vision, the people perish. And a lot of times we turn to this verse in regard to ministry. We look at this verse in regard to how a church is led. We look at this verse in regard to ministers and elders and leadership and that sort of thing. But I think it also really applies, especially in having a shared vision as a couple and as a family, that where there is no vision, the people perish. We look to our families, the relationships that we share with our spouses, the relationships that we share with our children, and to recognize that we have so much to take care of, so much to do in regard to leading our families, leading our children, leading our spouses, and also being led ourselves. Ephesians 5:21, it's the beginning of really that section out of Ephesians 5 where the Apostle Paul is talking about wives and husbands. Wives, submit to your husbands. Husbands, love your wives. And he moves on to other relationships, parents, children, and then also slaves, master. But ultimately recognizing, verse 21, that we submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And especially when it comes to husbands and wives, and this idea of mutual submission. And the reality that sometimes we don't do this very well. Aaron Norris is doing a great job of that right now. But especially with the concept of shared vision as a couple and as a family, if we're not moving forward collectively, if we're not on the same page with our faith, with our values, with our priorities, is it because of a lack of mutual submission? That somehow, if we're not in mutual submission to one another, that it's being irreverent toward Christ? And somehow, if I am in submission to God, if I'm submitting to God the way that God desires for me to, somehow it's a little bit more easy for Tirsa to submit to me the way that God has designed for her to. Somehow when my relationship with God is more of what it is intended to be, it's easier for my and Tirsa's relationship to be more of what God intends for it to be. At the core of having a Christian shared vision is Christ. And maybe that just kind of goes without saying, but I think sometimes we just, in our marriages, in our relationships, we just kind of go along to get along. We just kind of go along with, well, this is how we do things. These are the things that we are about. These are the priorities that we have. And it's pretty easy to say that, yes, Christ is at the core of our marriage. Christ is at the center of what we're about and the priorities that we have. But it's pretty easy for Christ not to be, as it's reflected in our actions and in our priorities and in the things that we hold dear. And no matter what our shared vision is, it's going to fall short unless our shared vision is Jesus. We sing songs like, on Christ, the solid rock, I stand, on all other ground is sinking sand. We sing those songs, but I wonder if we really believe them. The wise man built his house upon the rock, right? Not the sand. And to recognize that spiritual formation is central to our faith base and our having a shared vision. As we allow ourselves to be open to being shaped, to being formed spiritually. Recognizing that God forms us and He shapes us and He molds us more and more into the image of Christ if we will allow Him to. And yet we are only formed, shaped, molded into the image of Christ to the extent that we allow. And you know, to me as a minister, honestly, something that I struggle with, especially in doing counseling with others or ministering to families, is whenever you have one part of the equation, one One spouse who is all in, and the other spouse who's saying, yeah, I'm not quite sure about this. Oftentimes, just because of that reality, it generates conflict, conflict within the relationship. And if you have two people who are committed to God and to one another, Satan's goal is to separate us from God and us from one another. But if you have two people who are committed to God and committed to one another, there's nothing, even in a relationship, because oftentimes whenever Ryan and I are our elders and ministers, when we do minister to folks, especially to couples, there's been some sort of event that's brought them in front of us. The reality is, whatever Satan has made bad, God can make good. When you have a couple who has this shared vision, who's wanting to be formed spiritually, collectively, together, who's wanting to allow God to do what God does whenever we're open to Him. So spiritual formation, if you were to ask 10 different ministers what their view and understanding of spiritual formation is, you might get 10 different explanations, but really at the core of those explanations are three different values, three primary components: discipleship, community, and mission. Discipleship, how we follow Jesus, and to recognize that we follow Jesus individually, but as couples, we also follow Jesus together. As families, we follow Jesus collectively. How do we go about doing that? We're going to look just in a moment about in regard to some questions in regard to prayer and study and Scripture and things like that. If we're not a people of prayer, if we're not a people of prayer individually, and then if we're not a people or couples of prayer collectively, that's going to negatively impact our capacity to be formed spiritually. If you were to ask a Christian, any Christian on the planet, is it important to pray? I mean, I think you would probably have, I can't think of an instance where you'd have someone say, no, it's not. I mean, that might be the one thing we can all agree on. Yes, it's important to pray. And yet, if you were to ask each Christian honestly, how often do you pray? I don't know that our practice reflects our beliefs or our priorities, or at least the priorities that we think that we have. To pray together as a couple. If we're not praying together as a couple every day, we're diminishing the capacity that God has, that God gives for us to be formed spiritually. Community. Coming together for worship and for us to recognize that God forms us communally. Is church something that we attend and participate in together? And then beyond that, is worship something that we are excited about? Do our children gain a sense from us that this is a priority and this is something that's at the core of who we are as a family? And then not only coming together collectively for worship, but do we journey alongside of others who help us to be formed spiritually? Macro community and then micro community. And then also the idea of mission. How do we view others? Do we minister to others? Not only do we minister to others individually, do we minister to others as a family? Do we communicate to our spouses opportunities to be able to share Christ? Whether it's to share the gospel of Christ or just to be able to care for other people. And do we communicate that to our kids? Do our kids see a priority within us to minister to others, or do they hear negativity from us all the time? Do they hear from us that, well, these other folks don't have it together? What's our children in regard to mission? So discipleship, community, and mission. And really what that's asking is, what does it look like to look like Jesus? Tim Keller, in his book, The Meaning of Marriage, he asks the question, what if marriage was designed to make you holy rather than happy? How many divorces have occurred because one or both parties just came to the conclusion, I'm just not happy anymore? What if that's not what it's about? What if marriage was designed to make us holy rather than happy? And then another quote here from Keller, I don't have it on the screen, but he writes that marriage does not so much bring you into confrontation with your spouse, which at times we might disagree with that. Marriage does not so much bring you into confrontation with your spouse as it confronts you with yourself. And much of what Ryan has been about over these last weeks certainly have been to confront us with us, and then how that interacts, how that influences the relationships that we share with each other. You've walked to the front, and so I need to stop.
That's what that means.
Okay, all right.
Tirsa taught me that trick. All right. Here's what we're going to do. First of all, I love our preachers. I really do. We are incredibly blessed to have the men that we have delivering the messages that they deliver, and I can't thank Jason enough for being willing to help tonight. He's not done yet. We've got something else we're going to do. The discussion portion of tonight is designed to help you explore and expand on the concepts that Jason just described. The discussion questions tonight are designed to push you farther down the road. The quiz that you took when you sat down, there were some areas of weakness, there were some areas of strength. The discussion questions tonight are designed to help you bolster the areas of strength and to fortify those areas of struggle. So here's what we're going to do. Take a look at page 3. Page 3 is, as we always do, I'm of course not going to give you enough time to talk through all of them because I would never do such a terrible thing. I'm going to rush you and make you feel like you didn't quite get enough out of it. That's what I'm aiming for. Here's what I want. I want you to take about 2 or 3 of these, probably. As many as you can is fine, but I'm shooting for 2 or 3. When it's over, Jason and I are going to kind of explore the concepts in question 9. So if you want to avoid question 9, that's fine. If you want to go ahead and talk about it, that's fine too. But our goal is to have you walk out of here with some practical application. What can we do as a couple to make our marriage look more like a Christ-centered marriage? So take a few minutes, as we always do. I'm going to put a 2-minute warning up on the timer when it is time to wrap it up. So be diligent about that, but I'm sure I'll holler at you anyway. Go ahead and get started. All right. If you would go ahead and bring it on back. Here's what we're going to do. I told you we're going to explore question number 9, and we're going to take the preacher and the therapist approach to this. So if you were to walk out today to implement these principles in your marriage, Jason's going to speak for just a minute on what it would look like, and then I'm going to speak for a second on how that would impact your marriage and what the impact of that might be. So Jason, I'm going to hand the first one to you. We're looking at question number 9. What are some practical ways you can better embrace these components of spiritual formation? So we're going to start with discipleship.
I think with each of these, you have to determine as an individual, as a couple, and as a family, what's going to work for you, because what might work for one individual or one couple or one family might not work for another. But I think for us to zero in and center upon a few different ideas, and maybe just to give some practical insight into maybe how somebody might be able to be a better disciple. For me, if I don't spend the first hour of my day praying and studying Scripture and reading things that are going to benefit me spiritually, it begins to impact who I am as a person. It begins to impact who I am as a father. It impacts who I am as a minister. Now, I recognize that not everybody has the benefit and the blessing of being able to take that first hour of the day to be able to zero in on those things. And so I think we each have to just determine what it is that works for us. How do we, if we say that prayer is important, to make a decision as a couple before we go to bed every night, we're going to pray. And for us to take the lead on that and take ownership of that. And if the husband takes the lead on that and he's not doing it, for the wives to remind him, we committed as a couple that we're going to pray together before we go to bed at night. To have devotionals as a family. Maybe that's once a week and it's scheduled. Maybe it's just whenever all of a sudden you realize, Thursday evening, and for once this month we've got everybody together and we're going to read a little bit of Scripture together and just talk about that as a family. Something that Tirsa and I have done this last year, and again, we don't have this figured out. It's something that we've done this last year. We're looking at a daily devotional as a family. She got everybody a copy of it, for Christmas. And so January 1 got here, and every day I will send 2 or 3 sentences. We have a group text. I called it the Family Devo, and then Bowen, my youngest son, changed it to Lit Family Devo, which means it's really cool. But I'll just send 2 or 3 sentences out, just a devotional sort of thought. Maybe it's a scripture for everybody to be able to zero in on. For Tirsa and I, she's a big reader, and she reads a lot of not just scripture, but she reads a lot of books by Christian authors. And I benefit from that. Even if I'm not reading the same book, it's just like, hey, I read this from Beth Moore this week, or I read this from so-and-so this week, and how we sharpen each other, we disciple alongside of each other. We talk a lot about following Jesus individually, discipling individually. We talk a lot about, you guys have heard me talk a lot about how we disciple collectively. That's what we do as a church family. We do this thing together. We also disciple as couples and as families. But I don't know that we always see it from that perspective whenever we really should.
Well, and the benefit from a marriage perspective of everything Jason just described, we've talked since week 1. We've talked for 9 weeks now about being deliberate in our choices and deliberate in our marriage. The idea that we're deliberate in our faith collectively as a couple, I can't express. You have to experience it. I can't express what the payoff for that is in a marriage. And I can't express the bonding experience that is in a marriage. When you're running as fast as you can towards God, and you're running as fast as you can in your faith, and you look next to you and your spouse is running next to you, it's an indescribable feeling. And it's something that, again, I could talk and attempt to explain it, but if you haven't experienced it, you really should, because it can do wonders for your marriage. All right, second part, community. So practical ways of embracing these components. So the next one is community.
To understand community as journeying alongside of one another. And the two primary ways that we do that are, number one, as a church family, but then secondly, we also do that just simply in the relationships that we share with others. Someone might call it macro community, big picture community, and then also micro community. Whenever we come together as a church family week after week, is that something that's a priority for our family? Are we intentional in coming to church and worshiping with other believers? Or, if we have time, we do it, and if we don't have time, we don't really do it. And is that something that we talk about as a family? Do our children, do they see from us that worship not only is a priority, but do they see from us that worship is something that we want to do? Or do we leave as we're headed to Luby's or as we're headed to Gloria's or what have you after church, and that preacher, he sure preached off a long time. Or, the worship, that song leader, he was a little bit off today, or whatever it is. Do our children hear from us that we are consumers of church? Or do they hear from us that worship, at the end of the day, it's for God, and that worship's to glorify God, and that what we do collectively, we do that together, and the whole goal of that is that God should be glorified. So that's macro community, and then also micro community. Having relationships, not only individually, that we are forging with other believers to journey alongside of each other, to sharpen each other, but do we do that as families? Do we have other couples that we have a shared vision with and shared priorities with that we are journeying alongside of in life?
I think that also speaks to the value of a church family for a marriage. We are in a weird time where we're so connected. We're more connected than we've ever been, but we don't know our neighbors. We're as digitally connected as the world could have ever imagined being. But again, we don't know the people in our community. Having a church family and having a group of people that are like-minded and reaching for the same goals cannot be understated in its value to a family. The fact that many of us have children who feel very close to people outside of us, who we trust, we know, we love, and we understand that we're all fighting the same fight and pushing for the same goals. Again, the value in that can't be understated. In the interest of time, we need to talk about the last one quickly, and then we'll move on to our last activity. So the next question is mission. How do we implement mission?
Yeah, and maybe for us to recognize that this idea of mission, it's similar to the other two in the sense that even though there are a lot of commonalities, there's a lot of these things that we have to fabricate for our own families. What is this going to look like uniquely for each and every one of us? The idea of mission is, how do we minister to others? Maybe how we minister to others, that begins with how do we view, how do we see others? Again, as our children look to us, do they see a narrow negative view of the world? Do we impart upon them or convey to them a negative perspective of humanity or of our neighbors? Or do we communicate to them that, as a family, we're going to do what we can in order to reveal and to share Christ? We're going to do what we can in order to impart some sort of faith, some sort of knowledge of Jesus just in kind, compassionate actions. And then recognizing that we do that not only as individuals, but we do that as a family, and for us to be on the same page. I think for each of these, And really with this concept of shared vision, for us to as a couple, to identify and maybe even deal with the struggles that maybe we're currently having in not being on the same page or not having a shared vision, to identify those things, and then once they're identified, to hold one another accountable. If we say that this is our goal, if our goal is to have a shared vision, if our goal is to be a Christ-centered family or to have a Christ-centered marriage, are we taking the proactive steps to move us forward as a couple and as a family?
Which is a fantastic lead-in to our
thought that was
final
pretty
activity.
good.
It was, yeah. You knew what we were doing, didn't you? So here's where we're going to end it tonight. I want you to know Jason and I discussed this weirdly at length. It seemed like a no-brainer, and then it wasn't. And the reason it wasn't is because where we're going to end is going to be a little uncomfortable, maybe a little awkward. I hope not. If there's any place where this should be a comfortable experience, I would think that this would be it. At the base level, if you want to create a more Christ-centered marriage, everything you've heard tonight, I think, is of value. And I appreciate Jason's perspective, and I appreciate his take. But at its core, if you want to create a Christ-centered marriage, a more Christ-centered marriage, at its core, it starts with prayer. And it starts with a collective prayer, you and your spouse praying together for a variety of things, not just for your kids, not just that they'll marry good people, not just that they'll be okay, but prayer for your spouse, prayer for each other, prayer for the marriage. I want you to flip over to the last page, on page 4. You will see a list of prayers. What you see on page 4 is as much as I could come up with. It's not an exhaustive list, so if you see stuff on there that doesn't apply to you, skip it, and if you do, circle it. Here's what I wanted to assume. I wanted to assume that I have couples in here tonight that, despite the fact that you've wanted prayer to be a mutual part of your life and you've wanted to pray together with your spouse, it's not something you do regularly. And that when you do, you have a tendency to maybe go to the same place every time or not dig quite as deeply as maybe you could. So what I'd like for you to do, I want you to just take a minute or two and look through that list. And if anything jumps out, circle it, star it, eye it. You don't have to circle anything if you don't want to, if you're not comfortable. But look through that list. And then how I'd like to end it tonight, I want to give you a couple of minutes. And I'd like to ask you to engage in a prayer with your spouse. And if you find stuff on that list that helps you in that process, then please do. If you want to completely ignore that list and pray for something specific for you and your spouse, by all means. The goal here is not that you'll use my conversation starters. The goal is that you will have an opportunity to connect spiritually with your spouse. I know it's going to sound weird to put you on a prayer timer, but we're going to do that because we want to wrap this up efficiently, and we don't want to have anybody keeping kids longer than they have to. So take a second, and then at your discretion, I'm going to ask you to have a word of prayer with your spouse. I do this for a living. I work with couples for a living, and there's nothing on the planet that is more powerful than seeing a couple pray together. It's moving every time I see it, and it was moving tonight to see it. Here's what I hope. I know I told you this was all going to be laughing and joking, and here you are. It's a bonding moment. In a marriage workshop, marriage seminar, I would hope that you would expect to get at least a little bit of that. I want you to understand something. The goal tonight is not to embarrass anybody who wasn't where they thought they would be with this conversation. The goal tonight, though, was to point it out to you so that you knew where you needed to go and how you might better get there. If you're doing nothing else, pray together. Go back to the quiz, and I don't mean literally right now. Go back to the quiz. If you had a 3, let your goal be a 5 by the end of the month. Let your goal be a 7 by the end of next month. These are attainable goals. There's nothing on that list that's crazy. Those questions are about basic faith structure and couples growing in faith together. So whatever you're at, if you're a 1 or a 10, try to move up. That's what I want for you tonight. I want you to be ambitious about chasing your faith in your marriage. I want you to be ambitious about growing your faith in your marriage. That's the goal tonight.